species, really. Because the artist does many things, not the least of which is to hold up to us a kind of mirror by which we see and understand ourselves more clearly and more fully. It is an important part of life. It is an extremely important part of our economy, particularly here in the Hudson Valley, with Woodstock and all of the other areas where work is being done by artists in the various communities here. The work is done here very often, and then it is taken someplace else and shown somewhere else, in Manhattan or some other place, some other venue where there are larger numbers of people. But so much of the important artistic work that is going on in our country right now is taking place right here in the Hudson Valley, in Ulster County, in the Catskills, and in the surrounding regions. And so we celebrate that here today, and we appreciate it and recognize it. And we do so with all of you who are here, and I think particularly, although I think Doug will introduce Alf, will you not? Yes. We do particularly with our dear friend Alf Evers, who is a continual reminder of the wonderful relationship between art and life. And I think, if I may say so, Alf, in your case, that life can be a work of art itself. Thanks very much.
Ready? Well, first of all, I want to apologize for speaking to you sitting down, but it happens that my legs are almost 92 years old. The rest of me is a little younger, I hope. Maurice has presented the situation so well that it's all I can do is to expand on it in certain areas. I think he shows a wonderful grasp of the role of the art in society, and I know that he's in his work as a congressman and before in the state legislature, his concern was largely with the environment, but he has always had the arts in mind, which is something that is rather rare among people who manage our political affairs. I'd like to start out by saying that the Catskills, peaceful as they look, except when we're having a debate about the watershed or about zoning or something of the sort, has actually been a battleground, not in the sense that Gettysburg and Bunker Hill are battlegrounds, but it's been a battleground of ideas in which there's been opposition to the influence of the artists. The artists and the entrepreneurs in the Catskills have battled over the years and arrived at compromises occasionally. And it began in the colonial days when the Europeans who invaded North America and began pushing the Indians out saw the land solely as a source of profit. And they viewed the mountains as sources of precious stones and minerals, and the streams as sources of beaver fur, which was then having a great run because of the fashion for hats made from beaver fur, from a felt made from beaver fur. And so there were no artists in the early years. The Indians were, in a sense, partners. In the fur trade, the Indians were partners to such an extent that eventually they exterminated the beaver, virtually exterminated. And that was the beginning of the degradation of the region. The beaver, which had played an important role in building up the soil in the valleys through their dams. They would build a dam, it would catch silt from above and provide meadows and fields where crops would grow magnificently for a while. It explains why it was possible to farm in the Catskills in the early years. The presence of the beaver dam, as well as the forests above, whose roots and dead leaves on the ground retained the nutrients in the soil that that could keep vegetation going. But this this situation changed, and the Indians were driven out, and the whites who were in charge turned to emphasizing farming and in the valleys and growing of wheat and so forth. The only influence of artists at the time was in doing sketches for engravings, which made the region look attractive to immigrants who hoped they could be lured to the Hudson Valley by the Dutch West India Company to grow the cash crop of wheat, which went to the West Indies and even to Europe, and was a fundamental source of income for the government. That and the beaver. But the beaver, as I say, was, by the end of the 1600s, was pretty well exterminated. They were there, but they had to go farther and farther to get them, deal with distant Indians, the Iroquois, the Indians of Canada. All sorts of complications developed. The beginning of an impact by art on the region was as the 18th century ended, after we had our independence, and we began to have a feeling of pride in America. It was our own. Before that, we had been a colony of a European power, first of the Dutch in the Hudson Valley and then of the English. Now we were our own people, and we began to feel a pride which was expressed in speeches that were made and in things that were written. And among the subjects for pride was the American landscape, the American animals, the distinctive flora and fauna of this continent. Some of it could be turned to use, but not all of it. And there were botanists who came here simply for the love of learning about the world they lived in. People like William Bartram and John Bartram, who, before him, who came to the Catskills and studied the plants and reported on the waterfalls and the scenic wonders of the region. By the early 1900s, a greater interest in art was causing more artists to come to this country from Europe. George Washington commissioned an Englishman named Winston Lee to paint some landscapes for him. And here in the Hudson Valley, we already had in what we call the Leeds or Van Bergen overmantel, a long, narrow painting that went over a mantel in a farmhouse in the town of Leeds, which showed the Catskill Mountains, the first depiction of the Catskills and the farmhouse and the family. It's a great document in teaching us about what life was like in 1732 when it was published. But we had very little of that sort, occasionally a bit. In the background of a painting, there was one of a young man named Pau de Baudelaire, painted in Albany, which showed the Hudson River with a steep hill on the other side and a sloop on the water. Here and there, this would happen. You get a hint of a coming interest in the environment as shown by art when pride in the American landscape was developing. That Thomas Cole came to this country from England when he was 17 years old. He came from a manufacturing town, Bolton, which is now part of Manchester, and he aspired to be a painter. He was touched by the romantic feeling of the time. He liked to, in England, he and his sister would go to old manor houses, and he would play his flute while his sister recited poetry. He played his flute beside waterfalls and other natural wonders. And in other ways, he showed this rising of a sense of the need and the joy of giving the human imagination free rein, which was to have so wide an influence on all the arts, music and painting and literature through the 19th century. He turned up in New York, went up the Hudson River on a sketching trip, and went to the Catskills and painted two paintings of the lake with dead trees, North Lake, and one of the Catskill Falls. And these were shown in a shop window in New York, and made a great impression on some of the well-known painters of the day like Colonel Trumbull and others. The result was that he became very suddenly famous, and the American landscape as a subject for painting was discovered, and the possibility of teaching Americans to look more closely at their landscape and to expand their vision to encompass greater things than had been possible in the past came into being. When the first artists came to Woodstock in the early part of the century, one of them, John F. Carlson, came as a student, and Anita Smith, who tells in her book on the Woodstock history and hearsay of Levi Harder, a hardworking farmer, who said one day to John Carlson, "You know, until I never knew that the sky was blue until you fellas came here." The painters had taught him to look at the world around him and see more than he had ever seen before in his very hard-working life, when he kept, as they say, his nose to the grindstone. And so something began stirring. Cole became successful. He could sell all he painted. He settled in Catskill and took to the Catskills almost as an adopted home. He felt toward the Catskills the way William Wordsworth had felt about the Lake Country in England, and a sense of identifying with the landscape, not only loving it, but feeling that he was very much a part of it. And this feeling was stimulated by his paintings, which many of them were engraved. He was a very, very serious man, very, very religious. And he saw God in the landscape, as many people did in that romantic period. And he prayed before painting eventually. And he took himself very seriously. And he was dreadfully disturbed when he saw the indiscriminate cutting down of trees taking place in the region. First he showed it a little after 1830 in letters to his friends. He deplored the cutting of trees, and a little later the cutting of trees for a railroad. He objected to the railroads imposing straight lines across the landscape, which weren't natural. He later became somewhat reconciled to it, recognized that there were practical necessities that sometimes had to be compromised. But he, a short time before, in the early 30s, George P. Morris had written a poem that had an enormous influence called about the cutting down of a tree that was familiar to him. And he expressed anger at the cutting down of this tree. He wrote in the poem that, "In my youth it sheltered me and I'll protect it now." It was a sentimental poem, nothing about the environment in it, no sense of cutting the tree being anything but an act that annoyed a person who had been a good friend of the tree at one time. It was very different from Cole. Cole gave, in this poem of his called The Lament of the Forest, which was published in the Knickerbocker magazine in 1838, he gave a voice to a sense of the relationship of all of us to the landscape and to its vegetation. And he deplored what was happening then in the Catskills, the cutting of trees and the forest fires which inevitably followed. I'd like to read you a little from that poem. I think it's very extraordinary as an expression, not of great poetry. Cole was not a great poet. He had good ideas, but he used shop-worn poetic diction, which you have to accept, and was not quite as imaginative in a poetic way as he might have been, but nevertheless he expressed a great deal. And here is how part of that poem goes. "And thus comes rushing on the human hurricane." These are the tree cutters, boundless as swift. Our sanctuary, this secluded spot, that was North Lake, where he saw himself in his poem as imagining himself to be seated beside the quiet waters of North Lake, and the spirit of the forest was speaking to him. These words are the spirit's words. Our sanctuary, this secluded spot, which the stern rocks have guarded until now. Our enemy has marked. Notice how he calls these people enemy, and that's something that haven't come across earlier, that the improvers, the entrepreneurs who were not considering the future, were regarded as an enemy. Our enemy has marked. This gentle lake shall lose our presence in its limpid breast, and from the mountains we shall melt away like wreaths of mist upon the winds of heaven. Our doom is near. That's the doom of the forest. Behold, from east to west the skies are darkened by ascending smoke. Each hill and valley is become an altar unto Mammon and the gods of man's idolatry. The victims we. Missouri's floods are ruffled as by storm. He was foreseeing the spread of this destruction of the American wilderness across the nation, finally to the Pacific coast. And Hudson's rugged hills at midnight glow by light of man-projected meteors. We feed 10,000 fires. In our short day, the woodland growth of centuries is consumed. Our crackling limbs, the ponderous hammer rouse with fervent heat. Tormented by our flame, fierce vapors struggling hiss on every hand. On Erie's shore by dusky Arkansas, our ranks are falling like the heavy grain in harvest time on Volga's distant banks. A few short years, these valleys greenly clad, these slumbering mountains resting in our arms, shall naked glare beneath the scorching sun, and all their wimpling, rippling, rivulets be dry. No more the deer shall haunt these bosky glens, nor the pert squirrel chatter near his store. A few short years, our ancient race shall be like Israel's, scattered among the tribes of men. That's Cole's poem that was published in a literary magazine of the time. The Knickerbocker was widely read, but the time had not come for it. And it made very little impression. I've looked for it among other publications of the time, and I found very little mention of it, and that not particularly approving. Nevertheless, the statement had been made, an excellent statement, which we can agree with today. However, there was a ferment going on in the land, and by 1864, with a publication by Vermonter George Perkins Marsh of his Man and Nature, the thinking people around the nation and indeed around the world woke up to the fact that while the environment of the earth was being degraded, something might be done about it. He made a clear statement that is still a clear statement after all these years. The book was ignored for a long time, then reprinted, and continues to have its influence. By the time the first settlers came to the Hudson Valley, the forests of Europe had been very largely cut. Europe and Britain, when they were first settled by humans, were forested, dense dammed forests, and the trees were cut and farms were created, and people made livings there. And as the years went by, the remaining forest got less and less. By the time of Henry VIII, in the late 1500s, it was necessary in England to forbid the use of wood in stoking the fires of glass factories, which are enormous consumers of fuel, and suggesting that they use coal instead. We didn't come to that point until much later, centuries later. But the shortage was there, the making of iron and bronze for cannon and of glass and other products for export, as well as for domestic use, was nibbling away at the forests. In Britain and the continent were importing timber from Russia and from out-of-the-way places of the world. So one of the great advantages of the New World, the temperate zone, was that here were trees that could be cut and used for for example, for masts for the Royal Navy. They were ordered people in the colonies to go through the forest and mark all the tall white pines for use as the masts for the Royal Navy. They couldn't be cut by anyone else or for any other purpose. Nevertheless, wood pirates made their way into the forest and cut many of these pine trees up into shingles and took them out of the Catskills on pack horses because there were no roads at the time. And so we began to follow the same trail that had been followed in Europe, the settlement, which seemed like a rather joyous thing with people leading more or less contented lives as small farmers, and the farms being eventually converted into parts of large estates, and people turning to being tenants on not very good terms. We had some of that in New York State, the tenants for 3 lives and so forth. And with all of this went the slow disappearing of the forest, and with it the streams. By the 1850s, the tanneries were in full blast in the Catskills, and they had originally used oak for tanning and was supposed to produce the best leather. But when the supply of oak within reasonable distance of transportation was exhausted, they took to using hemlock, which produced a red leather. We didn't have the rich brown of oak tanned leather, but a reddish leather, which the canny tanners sold by candlelight so that the red wouldn't be as conspicuous. Every war stimulated the production of leather. It was widely used in horses' harness and so forth. So the tannery period had ups and downs. There were periods of overproduction and periods of underproduction. And there were periods of great slaughter of trees and the burning of the trunks that were left on the ground after the bark had been stripped to be taken care of by forest fires. And Cole's description of the smoky air tallies with descriptions in contemporary diaries and in newspaper accounts of the Hudson Valley filled with smoke from the Catskills. An example of how tinkering with one part of the environment can affect another. It was as far as New York. A pall of smoke at times, especially in the fall and the spring, hung over much of the state because of these forests. The timber was perfectly good, but it didn't bring a very high market value in competition with white pine, which was a better wood in the working and a better wood to use for siding and other purposes for which wood of that sort was usable. Nevertheless, the people in general, American people, began to, as they looked on the paintings on the walls of their parlors by the painters who would come to be known as the Hudson River School, they came or brought closer to the land. And they also, at the time, cities were growing, and in the cities, people were feeling the need of parks. And by the 1840s, New Yorkers were talking about building a great park. Eventually became Central Park. It was to provide the people of the city with a relief from the urban environment. Most of the people who lived in the cities had come to the cities from the country. They had a nostalgic feeling about their youth, and they spent amid the sunny fields and the woodlands of the country. And so it was welcomed. Parks in Boston, Philadelphia, elsewhere. Some of the first parks were cemeteries. The first park in Kingston, for example, was a cemetery. In Boston, Mount Auburn was a cemetery. And there they were well cared for, grassy places with trees and shrubs. People would gather there on holidays and so on. Gradually they grew into park systems. And eventually, as Maurice told you, the painters from the Hudson Valley made their way westward, and photographers. W.H. Jackson was a great photographer. My father knew him. He was, when he was my age, and my father was young, and he photograph the wonders of the West. And that helped bring an appreciation of what the West had to offer to Easterners and to Washington and to Albany and everywhere along the eastern coast, and eventually resulted in Yellowstone becoming our first national park. It was an important moment in our history, in the history of man and the land that he lives on, when that park was completed. It had been completed rather urgently because a railroad was being built to it, and the railroad had plans for exploiting it. And the park was enacted, the park legislation was enacted into law in order to head off exploitation. In the Adirondacks, lumbering was going on. Iron was being made, which consumed a great deal of charcoal. And Albany had, North Albany was the center of the lumber trade for an enormous area controlled by the Van Rensselaers. And people in New York began to be concerned. People who'd read George Perkins Marsh's book were aware of what had happened in other countries. Marsh had gone into the situation along the Mediterranean and the Near and Middle East, where overgrazing and overcutting had resulted in erosion and the eventual conversion of the landscape into something of a desert. Many of those deserts where the Romans had raised wheat to feed their populations had become deserts. And this began to alarm people who had influence. And the businessmen in New York became aware of this. They foresaw, it had been written, a number of people wrote about this with passion, that eventually, as the Adirondack forests would cut, the silt from the Adirondacks would make its way down the Hudson. The great New York Bay would be choked up with silt, and it would result in malaria epidemics as it had in the Roman Campagna and other places. And New York would cease being the major exporting city of the country. It had nosed out Philadelphia largely after the Erie Canal was built. And the Erie Canal would no longer function if the river was choked with silt, and all the products of the West that were sent to market via New York would no longer be sent to New York. They'd be diverted and go westward or down the Mississippi or some other way. So the talk of setting up a state forest reserve began to be powered by such organizations as the Board of Trade of New York, the Chamber of Commerce, the Association of Dealers in Wine and Spirits, and all sorts of other groups of people who were thinking not in terms of art, but in terms of the profits that would be lost if something were not done about the environment. So this was a strong motive power. At the same time, as I said, interest in the arts had grown in this country, and people were beginning to take vacations in the back country. Trout fishermen were going to the Catskills and the Adirondacks, and there was a feeling of the untouched part of the landscape being a part of life as it hadn't been before. It had been a source of income, not a part of a good human existence. And this helped. And what helped most of all was the efforts of a member of the state legislature who was always on the side of economy. And he had been a blacksmith in the sense of the legislature, and he never diverged from trying to save money. At the time, the tanners who had cut the hemlock forests for the sake of the tan bark and then abandoned the land rather than pay taxes, and the lumbermen who had cut the lumber and the trees down in the Adirondacks as well as the Catskills and then abandoned it, allowed it to be taken by the counties for taxes. And there was a vast amount of this land available, and it went by legislative act to the counties, and the counties were embarrassed with it. It was very hard to sell, and this assemblyman he was again the county taking it. They were getting in debt when they were buying this land, and that was a strong motive power in setting up the forest preserve. In the Adirondacks, there were some people like Plank Colvin who fought very much to set aside a part of the forested part of the state as a wilderness area or as a place to grow timber. There was some dispute about it at the time. But in the Catskills, there was very little. The Catskills by that time had become famous, more so than the Adirondacks. Rip Van Winkle, Washington Irving's creation, had made the Catskills famous around the world. And the play made from Rip Van Winkle had been a hit in London and in Australia and all over. And everywhere it went, it carried the name of the Catskills. People were very proud of this. But and it helped bring summer people to the Catskills, which was close enough to large centers of population, of course, certainly New York, to be at first a romantic place for the very rich at the Catskill Mountain House, who were aware who had read Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle and who owned Hudson River School paintings. And then it spread from there around the region, and all sorts of people were spending their vacations in the Catskills. About the time that Yellowstone Park came into being, the first railroad was built, the Ulster and Delaware, and that made it possible for people who lived in New York and worked in shops and factories to spend a 2 weeks vacation in the Catskills by rail. And along the line of the railroad in the Esopus Valley, various boarding house centers developed, some for Germans, some for Spaniards, and some for Protestants, some for Catholics. They were segregated that way largely by occupation. There was a hotel that catered to cigar makers, I remember. And it was a kind of segregation that we don't think of as inherently evil as we do of other segregations. It was people who did the same thing and had the same values, getting together and enjoying each other's company. Nevertheless, it was a kind of segregation. But the Catskills were getting, these people were enjoying what was left of the Catskill wilderness. And there was a public there that would accept having the Catskills become part of the forest preserve. It was, and that combined with the businessmen of New York and their fear of the silting up of the Hudson was enough to give serious consideration to the Catskills, like the Adirondacks before them, and becoming part of a state forest preserve. However, there was one problem, and that was the Legislative Assembly, chaired by a man named Sargent, who was a great authority on trees. He taught at Harvard. He was the head of the Arnold Arboretum. He and his committee came to the Catskills, and after looking it over, they sent in a report that held that the Catskills could never be reforested. The tanners and the lumbermen had done their work so thoroughly that trees would never grow in the Catskills again. They were doomed. So there was no point in making it part of a forest preserve. And the committee voted against it. But we see today a demonstration of the way a renowned expert can go wrong. And the forest preserve is covered with forests today. I wish Mr. Sargent were here to comment on it. So there we are. The artists continued to come to the Catskills, and part of after the forest preserve, they came to paint in the forests, and that was part of the attraction. They painted the rural scenes, farm scenes with sheep and so forth, as other painters did at the time. But the forests were also an attraction, and so were the trout streams. The water had always been one of the charms of the Catskills. When John Bartram came to the Catskills and went to the Catskill Falls and wrote what I believe was the first account of it in the 1740s and 50s, it was regarded as a very great wonder. Waterfalls were very popular at the time, And the Catskills had a wonderful supply of water in its trout streams, in its waterfalls, and in its lakes in Sullivan County, and so forth. It was one of the great charms, and is today one of the great attractions of the Catskills. Its water supply. It has a good rainfall, a good forest cover to hold the rain in the ground instead of letting it run off in floods immediately after it falls. And as I say, other artists came here. There were, every once in a while I learned of another one. The other day, or the other year, which a couple of years ago, a man who had worked at the Catskill Mountain House and whose father had run a boarding house there, told me that they had recently, at the old boarding house, which was still in his family, they found a lot of copper plates. And they puzzled over what they were doing there until someone remembered that an etcher named Ernest D. Roth had spent a summer there once. Some of these were used. There were etchings on them. Some were blanks. And when he left, he had left them there. Well, I remembered Ernest Roth. He was a friend of my family. He used to play with me when I was a little boy. And it was an example of the variety of people who were attracted to the Catskills. Many landscape painters of the time made sort of, some of them rather perfunctory visits. They went on to landscapes that hadn't been painted as much and so forth. But the Catskills remained a favorite place. Then in 1902, the colony at Woodstock came to the Catskills and added much to its reputation and to its what it has done to forward an understanding of the environment. Ralph Radcliffe Whitehead who founded the colony, had been born in a place called Saddleworth in the West Riding of Yorkshire in England. His family were mill owners in the valley of the River Tame. And they had originally used water power in their factories along the Tame, and then when steam engines began to come into being, they converted to steam. And that meant using coal, and that meant polluting the air. And I was there a few years ago, and I tried to find something good to say about the people who polluted this valley. And I found that the owners of the mills had lived within sight of their factories on the hillsides. The workers lived down in the valley, but the owners lived higher up. But their mansions were coated with soot, and they must have been liable to the same lung diseases that their employees were. But apart from that, it was not a stable society. One old man I met there told me that he remembered when you couldn't look across the valley of the Tame except on a very exceptional day for the smog that was there. Now it has been cleared up, and there's a Tame project inspired by the government, carried out by the government, that has forbidden polluting of the air, and it's returning to its old loveliness, and the stream is returning to its purity. A man I knew was the warden of the Tame, Lord Rhodes, who'd grown up there. And his secretary said to me once, let anyone toss a beer can in the Tame, and his lordship will be there in 10 minutes. They feel very strong, and they revere Ralph Whitehead, because when he came to Birdcliff, he let it be known that he was interested in taking care of the land. He explained in one of his articles that he wrote that the reason he had bought 1,200 acres at Birdcliff was in order to prevent speculators from vulgarizing, as he put it, the landscape. And he had a strong feeling about this. He took good care of the land at Birdcliff and was an influence locally in caring for it. But after Woodstock became an art colony, and Birdcliff descended from Birdcliff, but very different in that it emphasized landscape painting rather than the crafts, which Birdcliff did. The landscape began to change. More people poured in. The landscape school was supposed to be the largest school of landscape painting in the world. And there were huge classes would go out and spread over the landscape with their teachers in the summer. And the farmers found that they could sell land for building studios at a profit compared with continuing to farm, especially when the paint rags of the painters would poison their cows occasionally. Nevertheless, slowly farming began to deteriorate, and old timers who told me of their struggle to maintain a farm say that the artists never paid their bills and such things, and I suppose some of them didn't, but I don't think that was universal. But nevertheless, it caused conflict between the two groups, and it caused barns have been split up into studios in which the artists live as farming gave out, and even pig houses and so forth became houses for students with north lights put in the north side, and land began to be neglected. And in 1902, it had been a very lovely pastoral landscape with well-kept stone walls and fields going partway up the side of the mountain. The upper part was sheep pasture and woodlots, and the lower part were cow pasture, and in the valleys the grains were grown. It was a viable farming community, but it lost this, and it was because of the coming of the art county very largely. I apply to it sometimes the lines of Oscar Wilde in the Ballad of Reading Jail: each man kills the thing he loves. And the artists loved the landscape, and in a way they damaged it. They didn't kill it, but they did harm to it. But in more recent years, we have become a much more far-seeing community, and we had a planning board before other communities in the region had it, and some of us worked with the Catskills Center for Conservation and Development and helped spread the gospel of care for the environment around the region. I think I perhaps ought to end there. My throat is, I have a cold. My throat is beginning to give me signals. I don't think you might enjoy hearing me speaking longer, but you won't enjoy hearing me coughing any longer. Thank you.